Welcome back to LokadTV. Risk is endemic in supply chain. From a certain perspective, every single supply chain decision presents potential classes of risk, either directly or indirectly. Here to explain why, and importantly how to avoid them, Lokad founder Joannes Vermorel. So, Joannes, to quote the great American thinker George Costanza, in order to manage risk, we must first understand it. And to understand it, we must first define it. So in the context of supply chain, what exactly is risk management, and how does it differ from risk management in other fields like manufacturing?
The primary source of risk in supply chain is the future that you don't know. And in, let's say, manufacturing, if it's mostly about having the correct process. If you have the correct process, you can possibly produce, a billion parts without ever facing any defect. So potentially, manufacturing-wise, you can eliminate the risk, and the risk is not so much contingent to the future. For example, if you have a faulty process that creates a fire hazard for your factory, it's just a matter of time before the factory catch fires. So it's not, yes, it will happen at a point of time, indefinitely in the future, but if you have something that is broken in your manufacturing process, ultimately there will be a reckoning, it will happen. In supply chain, it's literally the future you don't know, and you can't really safeguard all the possibilities because that's too costly. There is always a possibility that the demand for a specific product spikes by a factor 20. But should you have in stock 20 times more than what you expect to sell, considering the applicable lead time and whatnot, just because there is this one remote possibility of facing this super unpredictable spike of demand? No. And so fundamentally, I would say, unlike some other domains, supply chain, there is the sources of risk are the future conditions that you don't know. And every decision that you take is kind of a trade-off about the sort of risk and rewards also that comes together about this uncertainty about the future. And I would say the uncertainty about the future is irreducible, unlike, let's say, the uncertainty such as, let's say, the physical hazards in your manufacturing process in a factory. Yes, zero risk never exists, although if you're looking at, let's say, a manufacturing process, you can get very, very close to zero. I mean, it's not absolutely zero, but it's very, very close. Supply chain-wise, look at any product, there is always like a double-digit percentage of risk that this product will not be sold anymore in the market 5 years from now. There is very, very few products that would say, you know what, we are absolutely confident that this product will still exist 5 years from now, especially if we take into account that the product can be replaced by a variant that still counts as a different SKU, but a variant that corrects a defect, adapts for a new regulation, or anything else that could happen between now and 5 years from now.
So again, just to kind of summarize that, are you saying that risk management in supply chain is purely a matter of minimizing the wasted resources, or it's just purely a financial concern?
No, I would say the source. First, I would say I was just describing the source of risk.
Okay.
So the source of risk is literally the fact that you don't know the future.
Okay. Agreed.
If you had, a magic crystal ball that would tell you the future, you could, in theory, had almost a risk-free supply chain practice.
Presuming one has enough money.
And the idea that this source of risk is irreducible is feels strange in many other areas. For example, in accounting, you have a risk of having accounting mistakes, but that's what those accounting practices are for, is to essentially eliminate this risk. And when you think in terms of risk associated to incorrect accounting practices, you really want to make that like super, super rare. You want, problems happen. Sometimes there is, you hire somebody and this person happens to be a bandit, but we are talking of the sort of risks that are like 1 in 10,000, you know, things that can be, if done properly, the risk is like super rare. It's not supposed to happen. In supply chain, you don't have the option. No matter if you're good, if you have the correct practices, the risk is irreducible. You might have a war, you might have lockdowns, you might have all sorts of floods, all sorts of events, fires, all sorts of events that are just beyond your control that will massively steer the demand one way or another. And that's the primary source of risk, is that you don't know, and everything that you can do is about mitigating those risks, but also, that's the other side of the equation, is that as there is risk, there is also opportunities, which do not exist. Let's say, again, if you look at accounting practices, there is nothing that you can really do that would, if you're lucky, generate a massive payback. You know, like the Monopoly game, like there is this card where error of the bank in your favor. No, that's not going to happen. In supply chain, it may happen. For example, if you happen to have a lot of stock of something while the market as a whole is facing a shortage, you can make potentially a nice profit in selling this inventory at a premium.
It sounds like a lot of those issues in supply chain will be much more common than the example you gave of, let's say, you hired an incorrect, or the wrong person, they're a bandit, they're duplicitous, let's just say 1 in 10,000. Again, vanishingly rare. But presumably the classes of risk you're talking about in the context of supply chain, like lead times being extended or even hastened by a couple of days, those are presumably quite regular and have predictable financial knock-on effects.
Yes, and they don't depend on you.
Exactly,
that's also one thing that is very different, is that if you're in a manufacturing process in a plant and you have, let's say, defects, fixing the process so that you don't have defects anymore, it's on you. You can potentially go to, you know, those zero defect state, which is perfection, or you can get very close to perfection. Again, if we go to the world of supply chain, not really. I mean, those things by definition, if you have a lead time, you have a supplier, and this company is beyond your control. And even if you internalize, you may have a transporter, and it's still beyond your control. And even if you internalize a transporter, the road might be cut because the highway is flooded, or there is something else. And again, it's beyond your control. So I believe that's what makes the supply chain practice so specific, is that you're dealing with a lot of risk, a lot of, also conversely, a lot of opportunities, and they are mostly beyond your control. So the only thing that you can do is to make decisions that properly balance those risks and opportunities.
So when you talk about opportunity in the context of risk, you mean missing opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, again, when you think risk, let's consider that a competitor can suddenly enter the market and lower the prices. That's a risk. So you may, if this competitor enter your market, lower the price, you might be forced to lower your price in turn, and then you're less profitable than you would expect, or even maybe you're not even profitable anymore. So that would be the risk. But just the opposite can happen. A competitor may exit your market. And in this case, well, you can raise your price and you're more profitable than you would expect. So you see, every time you think that there is a risk, there is the opportunity. If there is a flood, maybe your warehouse is going to get flooded, or maybe the one of your competitor get flooded. So you see, it's not, when people think about risk, again, in manufacturing settings, you have a clear goal, which is, this perfection. So when you think risk, it's necessarily, there is no specific really, there is no opportunistic random upsides. So you see, the best you can do is zero defects. Your factory may not suddenly produce 1% of the products that are well beyond specification. That's never going to happen. So the best you can have is zero defect, and there is not a single chance that your factory by chance happened to produce, once out of 1,000 something that is miraculously superior to what it was producing otherwise. But in supply chain, this may happen. You may have thousands of products, and for some random reasons, competitors just do mistakes. They don't have the proper amount of stock, they don't have the right capacity, or they have the wrong allocation. And then there are opportunities. Just to give you an example of that, a large European e-commerce, I'm not going to give the name, but one of their technique was that they would start selling fashion products, and they would identify very, very quickly in the season the bestsellers, like literally within a day or two. And what they would do is they would immediately pass a gigantic order to the original brand. And they would corner all the stock. And the idea was they were guesstimating that those products were selling surprisingly well. And the point was surprisingly well. And thus they were saying, okay, if this amount of sales comes as a surprise to us, most likely it comes as a surprise to the original brand. So what will happen if we pass a massive order? It will happen that we will be sitting on a fat pile of inventory while everybody else is running out of stock. And thus, we can sell by the same products, just putting a price that is a little bit more than what would be the normal price. And we will still, in the end, sell everything and not incur any penalty related to sales at the end of the fashion season. So you see, here the idea is that there is a surprising event, and product sells more than what I would say experts would expect. And then if you're smart, you can turn that into an opportunity to just corner the amount of inventory, the stock that happens to be still available, and then make, I would say, an exceptional profit on this product. So you see, the risk, you can see the risk is a stock out, but there is also the symmetric, which could be I would say the opportunity that arises.
Thank you. That example is quite interesting because it opens up a potential sort of fork in the conversation, because if I understood correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, the example you gave was one of a sort of reactive response to opportunity. So this clothes fashion seller spotted an opportunity and very agilely responded to this opportunity. So that was a reactive approach to managing opportunity / avoiding risk.
Yes.
Is that the best you can do in supply chain, or is there a proactive sort of before the event mechanism for anticipating these kinds of events? I would say I would have a twofold answer to that. So first is, you're very correct. It comes with, I would say, an agile mindset, an opportunistic mindset. And it applies equally for risk and opportunities. The interesting thing is that if you come from a perspective like manufacturing, this is absolutely not the perspective that you adopt. You just want to eliminate risk. Yeah, exactly. It's a matter that is static. So this is a static problem. Is either your process has basically no risk, no defect, no hazards, and you're good, and it's a stationary perspective. There is no, or it doesn't, and you have to fix it. Here in supply chain, the interesting thing is that when you try to approach risk with this sort of stationary mindset, you think of it as something that you could fix once and for all. But the problem is that you see that it doesn't work, because suddenly, if you have something that is completely static, then you can't capture the opportunities anymore. But the reality is that you can't react to the emerging risk as well. It's completely symmetric. So you have like opportunities that arise, but there will be risk that just bubble up and surprise everybody, and you need to react quickly as well. So it's symmetric. Now, what does it mean to be prepared?
as I was mentioning this example, this large European e-commerce who plays this game of basically doing corners of brand inventory. This is an established practice. So they know that due to the fact that, let's say, a large fashion brand is going to have a collection of maybe 20,000 distinct variants. So it's maybe something like 4,000 products, but if you count all the variants in terms of sizes, colors, you're going to have maybe 20,000 plus variants. Mistakes will be made, it's a certainty. You don't know which one, but the idea that a sizable brand could get everything properly sized in terms of inventory, I mean, it's a relatively safe bet to say that mistakes will be made. And thus you can establish a practice where you turn those mistakes, which are predictable. You don't know where the mistakes will happen, but you know that they will happen. And if you happen to engineer a process that is much more reactive than let's say, the process of the brand, then you can identify those situations and turn them to your advantage. Because you see, if the large brands were capable to identify the problem as fast as this e-commerce was, they would not let them purchase all the stock.
Of course.
It's because they don't even realize that they have this problem. And thus they say, oh, well, we are lucky. We have someone who is willing to take, the bulk of our inventory, and it's good sales. But then they would maybe a month later realize, maybe we should not have done that. Maybe we should have tried to spread the inventory around all our channels instead of selling the bulk of it to a single channel.
It occurs to me when you talk about engineering a process in a company like someone dealing with the fast-moving consumer goods, how exactly do you instantiate that? Like it's a top-down or a bottom-up sort of process? Sorry, what I mean is taking advantage of those opportunities. How do you instantiate that sort of process?
I mean, like most things in supply chain, it has to be, to some extent,
automated?
Top to bottom.
Okay.
Just because you can't expect people at the very bottom to have any way to re-engineer. I mean, we are talking of re-engineering the organization itself. So, for example, if you decide that your process is like is s&op, and then you have like quarterly session for s&op where you spend 2 months to establish your new forecast and have everybody agree on that, and then
consensus style.
Establish a big consensus, and then everybody is surveyed, and then you need to compile all the results, and then you need to retranslate the forecasts, which are, let's say, per week, per category, into something that makes sense in terms of decisions. When you have this sort of process, it doesn't matter if people at the very bottom are agile or not. The process and the organization itself prevents any kind of agility anyway. So to a sizable extent, if you want to be agile, this has to be engineered from the top so that this agility may even happen. But then once you have engineered something where it becomes a possibility, then yes, it's a much more, I would say, a bottom-up thing, because then it's about whether the various teams take advantage of this newfound agility.
It also occurs to me that there's another way to approach the idea of, again, risk and opportunity. Because if you just invert the example you gave, instead of focusing on the company who, oh, we're selling these T-shirts, they're going like hotcakes, let's corner the market on this. So that's them taking advantage of an opportunity. From the perspective of the supplier, if you're in a situation like that where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Joannes's clothing store calls me and says, oh, we want all the T-shirts that you have, all the black T-shirts, we'll buy them right now. is that something you should be wary of? Because again, there is risk and opportunity there as a supplier.
Yes.
Should I sell, guaranteed seller right now today, I clear everything, or well, should I investigate why would he be trying to buy these right now? Is there something else at play here?
I mean, again, you're operating at scale, so there is thousands of products. So you see, it really depends on whether you can even afford spending time. You know, if there is like an EDI connection and purchases are completely automated and there is not even somebody in the loop. You see, it really depends. But having adversarial behaviors all over the place is just, you know, another day in supply chain. Your suppliers are your best partners and potentially your competitors, because they can also, you know,
limit your ability to profit.
They can do all sorts of things to limit your profits. They can also become in time competitors, decide to have their own brands, etc. And the converse is true. If you're a brand, you can decide to internalize, and suddenly you compete with what was your former suppliers. I would say there is no general rules. It really depends. But the interesting thing is that, again, that's something that is a bit specific, is that in supply chain, you can put dollars or euros of rewards and opportunities on those sort of things. Again, if you go back to, let's say car manufacturing, how much does it cost to have a defect that kills one person? The answer is way too much. So you see, it's not exactly sort of things where you are going to do fancy engineering, because it's mostly not acceptable. So yes, in theory, economists would tell you, the cost of a human life in the US, according to various things, is, let's say, $5 million, whatever. You may even, you know, make a case for that, but the reality is that nobody is going to do really serious engineering. They would just do whatever they can so that those problems where you have somebody dying just do not happen, you know. And so there is no real financial engineering, because again, if you take it from the manufacturing angle, you just want to avoid by design those sort of problems, and you're not trying to optimize your risk in the sense of balancing the pro and the cons. You just want to eliminate that. But in supply chain, you can't, and it's going to be a real trade-off. Whatever you do has a cost, there is a reward, and it's only shades of gray. So it's not, so it's, you can always have a little bit more stock. You can always, you know, operate with a little less stock. And you can even try to operate with zero stock at all, and you just do back orders all the way. So it's, I mean, it is, you have a lot more flexibility, and also you have very little hard constraints, you know, in supply chain. As long as you're willing to pay, there is almost no constraints whatsoever. You want more storage space. I mean, if you're willing to pay for it, you can actually pay to have a second warehouse being built. So ultimately, it's all the sort of constraints, all the sort of risk and rewards, they are kind of soft, and thus they are very eligible to financial optimization, as opposed to have, let's say, life and death situation where people would say, no, we are not going to do a financial optimization of that. It has to be like a categorical answer. We just don't want that. You see it. So supply chain has this luxury that the vast majority of the problems are actually soft problems where, you know, you can go from super bad service to super good service, and the whole spectrum is possible, and it just the sort of cost structure evolves as you go for better quality of service or, you know, worse quality of service.
Again, thank you. The example you gave of car manufacturing actually presents a very nice segue, because I know in for car manufacturers like Ford, for example, how they manage risk, certainly with their autonomous vehicles, is to use digital twins. So you build a digital version and a digital environment, and then using algorithms, you subject the theoretical autonomous vehicle to a battery of tests, and you assess your risk without ever having to produce a prototype in the real world. And that's how one step for managing their risk. Is there anything like that for supply chain? Because again, it's not a physical product in and of itself, though it's composed of many moving parts.
So that's the interesting thing is that that's what you try to do in a way with forecasting. So you try to mitigate this risk that you have about this uncertain future through forecast. And ideally, if your forecasts were perfect, you would just eliminate this risk. And that's why there is many supply chain practices that treat forecasting accuracy as car manufacturers treat defects in their, let's say, brake pads as something that you should eliminate. But the problem is that unlike, let's say, defect in brake pads, where you can potentially bring this rate of defect to 1 per billion, so that is so low that it's completely inconsequential. The forecast inaccuracy is never going to go to 0.01% of error. It's usually going to be stuck if you look at the sort of granularity that makes sense forecast-wise for the decisions. So basically per SKU per day, you're going to be stuck with widely inaccurate forecasts, like 50% inaccurate on average, again, per day per SKU. If you look a few months ahead, again, your lead times are long, so you need to look somewhat far into the future. And thus, the interesting thing is that what do you have in terms of tooling and processes and methodologies to deal with these classes of risk? That's pretty much, by the way, the Lokad is doing probabilistic forecasts just for this reason. That's a way to embrace this uncertainty. But that is very different from the classical paradigm that just assume that the forecast will be accurate. And where if there is inaccuracy, this is treated as a defect that should be resolved. The way Lokad approach probabilistic forecasts is that we don't assume or even expect that those inaccuracies will ever go away. What we have is probabilities. We may, if we improve a little bit our models, to have probabilities that are a little bit more concentrated. So we have a vision that is a little bit sharper about the future. But the overall perspective is that it's going to remain extremely fuzzy and extremely uncertain no matter what.
Well, I do want to plant a flag there because I think there's an important point, and I just want to amplify, while planting a flag, amplify the point, mixing metaphors. When you talk about forecasting future demand, most people would hear that as, just looking at data, again, previous sales data and coming up with a number, like on a time series, like we'll sell X, we'll buttress that with some safety stock, whatever. Is your position that the probabilistic forecasting approach will factor not only the historical data, but the other classes of risk we're talking about, like extended lead times, a boat gets stuck in a canal or something, like all these other classes of risk, and merges them together?
Yes.
And that's a way of risk managing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's typically why we, at Lokad, we typically speak of predictive modeling rather than forecasting. Forecasting, in theory, I would say you could forecast lead time, you could forecast anything, but the reality is that when you say forecast, the default expectation is that you're talking about the demand or the sales.
Exactly.
That's 99% of the situation when people say we have a forecast, they mean a forecast of the sales or the demand. But the reality is that anything that is uncertain about the future can be anticipated, and thus we have this predictive modeling. The interesting thing is that there is plenty of things where you can model risk even if you don't have really data. For example, war. In Europe, if you look at the last 100 years, there has been like one major war every half a century. So what does that mean? That means that every year there is like a 2% chance that there will be a war somehow that would impact. If you can go back five centuries in the history of Europe, and that's something that has been happening over and over. I hope that and I hope that the risk, that's a belief, and maybe but maybe a hope that the risk of actual war for Western Europe is fairly low at the moment. But again, if you take, I would say, an historical perspective, saying that there is a 2% chance to have like a massive disruption is not relatively insane. And look at what is happening in Ukraine. The risk is definitively real. And 20 years ago, it was in ex-Yugoslavia. So those sort of things do happen. And you don't need to have like precise data to say, well, we can put a 2% risk of a major disruptive event. You can also say that you might be, depending on the region, you might be flooded. You might have fires. You might have, again, there are plenty of risks where you can do a ballpark assessment. It's better to do that as opposed to pretend that those risks don't exist at all. And then, and with a probabilistic forecast, to add a 2% risk that is a bit, guesstimated, to say a major drop of demand, that's technically fairly straightforward. In contrast, if you approach the future with classical deterministic time series forecast, it's almost impossible to do that. I mean, yes, you can say we have a scenario where there is like a disaster happening, but how do you reconciliate this scenario, which is widely divergent from your primary forecast, with what you're doing in a daily basis? It's in practice you can't. So there is many companies that say, oh, we do scenarios, we model risk, but the reality is, yes, but what about your day-to-day decisions? All those day-to-day decisions are 100% driven by the median forecast or the average forecast, which completely ignores all the risk. And so in this sense, yes, you did some intellectual exercise to think about risk, but if all the decisions that you take on a daily basis do not embed this risk one way or another, then this is just an intellectual exercise. It has this analysis of risk has no consequence on what you're doing on a daily basis.
I do want to push you a little bit on this point because I actually am also curious. So if you think of other forecasting techniques, like let's say forecast value added, in which you have people collaboratively adding to a forecast, and the idea is that different departments have insights. And to take an example, a new competitor is about to emerge, and you take that information, marketing has that information, and they sort of somehow fold that into a time series. And that's kind of difficult to do because how do you translate that sort of knowledge into a forecast? Similarly, and this is where I'm pushing a little bit, how exactly does one factor a 2% chance of war in Western Europe into a probabilistic forecast to arrive at the number of units I have on my shelf? Like, because they seem kind of similar in a way.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the time series. You see, time series are, nowadays people think that, I mean, there is this general belief, not everybody, but I would say most mainstream supply chain practitioners only think of the future through the lenses of the time series. Time series are incredibly narrow as a way to express anything that you know about the future. For example, if you can say, let's say you're a B2B company, so your clients are other businesses. A very basic risk is just one of those big clients leaves you to go for another one of your competitors. And when this happens, all the products that they were buying from you, they would cease to buy anything. And if you had, for example, you were keeping in stock a product that was very routinely purchased by this one customer, but this one customer just suddenly leaves you, then this pile of inventory just becomes dead stock overnight, just because although the stock was rotating nicely, it came with a hidden risk that this client could leave you.
Yeah, so it didn't sell, it only sold to one person.
To
it was
one
not a seller overall.
Yes. So here we have, and the idea that this big client can leave you is, I mean, it's not like a super sophisticated idea. Any salesperson say, well, we had this client, there is always this risk that they leave us. Now, the problem is that if you frame your anticipation of the future with time series, you're stuck. You cannot express that because the information that you have is about the client, not about the products. And if you say there is this risk of this product going to zero, yes, but the thing is this risk is highly correlated. It's all the stuff that this client is buying that can go to zero at the same time. And it's a very, very different sort of risk of saying that this product in isolation can go to zero. You see, that's so here we have the first thing is, and that's the main problem when you think about risk, is that time series are just not appropriate to even express risk.
So that was a really nice point. Just to make sure people didn't miss that. Time series is correct me if I'm wrong. Time series is a reflection of a client's relationship to a product, but not the products themselves.
Time series is just a one-dimensional, measurement. So you have a measurement that falls every day, every week, every month. That's called equispaced time series. Yeah. That's what people have in mind when they think time series. So it's a one-dimensional measurement, and it's literally like temperatures. There were temperatures in the past. There will be historical, and there will be temperatures in the future. And so you can extend this time series. And when you extend the time series intuitively, what you expect is it should be correct. The time series is symmetrical. The past and the future it's just the same time series that continues. And if you do your job well, as you do the measurement in the future, it just match.
Because of the previous relationships that pre-existing customers had with the products you bought. But that says nothing about future.
The problem is that, again, the information that you have is at the granularity of the customer.
Exactly.
And your forecast is at the granularity of the product. There is a mismatch. And there is no translation to go from this information to this other information.
That's a key point.
And that's the problem, is that you can kind of duct tape your way in a limited fashion, but the reality is that you can't. You have to cheat. And when you go, and that's something in mathematics. When you cheat, you end up with weird stuff. That's, for example, when you cheat just a little. Let's say, for example, the Earth is a sphere, approximately. It's not exactly a sphere, but it's close enough. So when you want to have a map, you're projecting a sphere on a flat surface. So if you look at a world map, you end up with, and there is no escape. No matter how you do it, you end up with weird stuff, such as, for example, Africa. In European maps, Africa is going to be very, very small compared to Europe, although Africa is actually bigger than Europe. And that's just an effect of the distortion, because, well, you're using a flat surface to represent a surface. Mm-hmm. But here, the problem is vastly bigger. So you're trying to represent something, so those risks, it's a many dimensional objects that you're trying to represent as a one-dimensional object, your time series. And so the sort of problems that you have and distortion that you have are absolutely gigantic. If you think that just, again, Africa is going to look smaller than Europe and whatnot, those are deformation. That is like a very, very modest problem compared to the sort of problems that you have in supply chain when you try to inject those information that you know about the risk into the time series. So that's the first point, is that time series you have to give up. We have another problem, is that when you don't know the solution, it's very difficult to think about the problem. So here, that's also why, due to the fact that people are not really familiar with the class of mathematical models that could represent, those risks that are, so that would be higher dimensional models, they are stuck with, due to the fact that I'm struggling to even imagine something that would be anything but a time series. I'm stuck with the time series. But the first step is, okay, no, we have to acknowledge that this is not a correct representation. It doesn't matter if it's not very clear yet what should be used. I would say it's not very clear, but if you have an understanding that it's not going to fit, then it's okay. Then there are some technical things. For example, it's not very clear how a logarithm is computed, but that's fine. You don't necessarily need to have a clear picture of the thing to use it successfully. So then we can go to the second part, is how does Lokad leverage those sort of information? Well, the idea is that when you want to think about the future, the high dimensional version is to think that every single possible future has a probability. So you could think of it as, so this probability for any given future where you know exactly the sales level of everything.
Talk about demand, things that will be sold again.
Yes, so think of just one instance of a possible future.
Yeah.
You have this amount of unit being sold, those are the lead times, those are the exact conditions.
Yeah.
There is a probability of this happening. It's vanishingly small, but if you have the proper mathematical tools, you can work with vanishingly small probabilities. And again, due to the fact that you have a very, very large number of possible futures, it will still add up to probability 1. There is one future that will happen, and and the sum of all those probabilities do 1. I mean, that's the fine point gets when you start thinking about probabilities in very high dimensional spaces, potentially infinitely dimensional spaces. It becomes like very weird, but nevertheless, there are ways to work with that, and the idea that you can factor a risk like 2% chances of losing this client.
Exactly, yeah, that one.
It's not. I mean, it's not necessarily that difficult. Again, if you think of it really depends on how do you see the demand. If you see the demand through the lenses of the products, then it's very difficult to inject the clients. But if you see the demand as the result of the behavior of the clients, and you forecast the behavior of the clients, then you can say, I just have, let's say, my pool of clients. Let's think of them as agents. Those clients, they do their things, and in my model, the result of their behaviors is the demand that I observe for the products. If you tackle the demand from a more, I would say, a generative perspective, so you try to see where does this demand come from. It comes from clients that have certain behavior, and you try to forecast the behavior of the clients. Then adding this extra risk of the client losing you becomes something relatively straightforward. You can say, well, I have my pool of clients. Every passing month, there is, let's say, a 1% chance for every single client that they would leave me. And there will be maybe every month, on average, I will get a new client as well. Something like that. So you see, it really, it's just another type of forecasting model that is not necessarily skew-centric or, again, time series-centric. You can build your forecast in different ways.
And in terms of, let's say, the agility that one has using or leveraging a time series approach versus the agility one has leveraging the probabilistic approach, what's the difference there? And how does it then translate to managing risk? So
the main point is that time series risk do not exist, and they can't even exist. It's like a cube in a two-dimensional space. There is no such thing as a cube. You can draw a cube, but fundamentally it just do not fit. It's like that's a problem when you have extra dimensions that do not fit. You're stuck. If all you have is a two-dimensional plane, you can't stuck a cube in that. It's just it's this extra dimension will never fit into your plane, no matter how you do it. And so with time series, well, you're kind of stuck. It just do not fit. And you could duct tape things, and when I say duct tape, you could say, oh, we can't deal with the risk, but we can cheat by having an incorrect forecast that is intentionally distorted so that the decision that is going to be made based on this forecast reflect this risk. Wow, that's a very convoluted way to get to this risk management thing. So that's why you see, technically it is possible to kind of do it, but it's going to be ways that are very, very strange because, for example, you can deal with the risks by making your forecast intentionally less accurate by introducing distortion, intentional distortion in your forecast. Okay, that's one way to deal with risks, but that's a very, very convoluted way to get to that. And then when you will want to assess whether your forecast distortion that you have introduced actually do what you expect from those distortions, it's going to be also incredibly difficult. So if you go to the probabilistic approach, you have, and when I say probabilistic, I mean high-dimensional, I would say probabilistic forecasting, then by design, you have something where you have those probabilities. So, and there is no, and by the way, that's also something that is very interesting, is that once you have those probabilities, there is another part of the challenge, which is how do you do an optimization? It's called the stochastic optimization process. How do you optimize a decision when you have uncertain conditions? So you need to do an optimization that is like that has a natural affinity to these uncertainties that exist in the initial conditions.
Okay. Well, you mentioned as well the idea of assessing, and I'm curious how exactly. Well, no. Let me restart that question. If you're in a situation where you have a company and you embrace the probabilistic approach, you have been doing time series, you're won over. They were won over by what you just said. And then they're presented with a recommendation, which is the ultimate product of the probabilistic forecasting methodology. And in that, in whatever value has been presented, there's actually a lot of those factors have been baked in. For example, the possibility of war, the possibility of losing a client, and the management look at that and think that's insane. How exactly are they supposed to interact with that? Because again, there are so many things being factored into that. How do you bridge the gap?
So first, what is the output? And that's where there is a radical divergence.
Okay.
The output of, I would say, a risk-driven supply chain process that is powered by, again, probabilistic forecast, because literally it is, to my knowledge, pretty much the only viable technique that we have to deal with risk. That's what probabilities are for.
Yeah.
The output are the decisions, not the plan. That's a weird thing, is that when you think that the future can be known, so you can eliminate all the risk. Again, supply chain risks are mostly about this uncertain future. If you think that you can have an accurate forecast, then the output of your supply chain practice is the forecast. And the forecast is your plan, because once you have the forecast, it's just a matter of orchestration for the decisions. If you take, I would say, a risk-driven approach, then the output of your process is not the plan. It's not the forecast. It's the decisions. But if your risk-driven process is bad, because it can be bad, it will lead to bad decisions. And how do you identify? So how do you challenge a decisions to be bad? Well, it happens very differently. Again, if we go to the classic perspective, people would think in terms of forecasting accuracy, because that's the end game. If you go for risk-driven, you would say there is the decisions. This decision has risk and opportunities attached to it, expressed in dollars or euros. And so if you see a decision that is bad, essentially you're saying the assessment in dollars or euros that has been made about this upcoming decision is wrong. And so you can pinpoint. And if you're, the way Lokad do it is we would typically, for every decision that we generate, we decompose the economic drivers so that we could say we have half a dozen of drivers that reflect what goes into this decision. And so if you want to challenge that, you would challenge a component and say this, let's say the carrying cost, the risk of carrying cost you estimate looks completely off. And so yes, that's a role of the supply chain scientist to reverse engineer the process to identify what's wrong with this estimate. But it is very technical, but the reality is that if you have classic time series forecast that is very wrong, you say this time series forecast is very inaccurate, but once you say that, investigating the root cause of that is going to be a very technical undertaking as well.
It actually, if we go back to earlier, we were talking about proactive approaches to risk management, which was, let's say, the digital twins in the automotive industry, and then the sort of reactive risk management from the clothing analogy you gave. Probabilistic forecasting sounds almost proactive in the sense that you're simulating worlds in which you make this decision, here is the anticipated response. You make this decision, here's the anticipated response.
So it is proactive in the sense that you just say, there will be fluctuation. There will always be fluctuations that are way beyond my control. That's what this irreducible uncertainty about the future is about. And thus, based on that, I need to be able to engineer a process that is going to react swiftly and adequately to those changing conditions, whether they are impacting me positively or negatively. And so, yes, it is very proactive in the sense that engineering such a process that lets you, take advantage of the opportunities as they arise and mitigates the problems as they arise. It takes a lot. It comes with a lot of preparation, but it is not. I would say, fooled by the idea that you can prepare so much as it would lead you to an elimination of the uncertainty in the first place. You see, that's not the end game. It's a bit of, I would say, a dogmatic position in a way, but it's the idea that you can't get to the bottom of this, I would say, predictive modeling rabbit hole. You can't get to a model that is going to be 100% accurate. That's never going to happen. And the amount of residual uncertainty is going to be very, very large. And thus, what you're left with is engineering a process that is very, very good at, I would say, keeping up with the change as you observe it. Because you see, that's the thing, is that very frequently companies get surprised by stuff that happened months in the past. You see, that you would say, oh, we don't know the future, but what about the past? We know the past, but if your average response time to something that you've already seen is like 6 months, then you may end up being surprised by something that is already a couple of months in the past. And companies very regularly do get surprised in this way.
Again, I do want to push a little bit here, because I know if we want to talk about risk management, we should talk about how we assess our risk management practices.
Yeah.
And again, to come back to time series v probabilistic approaches, if you have a time series and it's wildly wrong, I can point to that and say, well, that was wrong. It was massively incorrect. And that is, it's binary. It either was accurate or it was not. You said we would sell 100, we sold 10. You were out by an order of magnitude. With the probabilistic approach, you're providing probabilities. You're not saying this is definitely what you'd sell. And does that sort of insulate you from being wrong?
No, I mean, yeah, there are metrics for the accuracy of probabilistic forecast. But even more interestingly, you can assess the correctness of the decisions themselves. And that's forget the probabilities. They are just a transient computation artifact. There are plenty of other artifacts, numerical artifacts that goes into the calculation. They are inconsequential in the sense that if you have the incorrect probabilities, but you still get the correct decision, does it really matter that your probabilities are wrong?
What do you mean by that? You have the incorrect probability, but you still made the right decision, for example?
There are, again, people don't realize, or don't always realize, but computers approximate stuff all the time. Whenever you do a calculation, you just use a certain number of digits of precision. Is the loss of precision important or not? The answer is, well, it depends. And in the supply chain, it depends on what? Well, it depends on whether the final decision is good or bad.
In terms of?
And so what I'm saying is that there are tons of approximations being made, different classes of approximation. It can be an approximation such as we have finite precision in our calculation. There might be other classes of approximation where we remove certain factors, where, let's say, the supply chain scientists just decide that, let's say, in Iceland, Ramadan is not big enough to be factored in. You know, again, that maybe I'm just making that up, but let's say they analyze this data and they say, well, in the impact of Ramadan in Iceland is negligible, so maybe we can just neglect that. In contrast to do that in Morocco, where it's massive and it should not be neglected. But you see, so you do approximation, because even if in Iceland you would say, we can neglect that, there will still be, I don't know, 0.1% of the population that happens to be Muslim. And thus, it's not like it doesn't exist, it's just that it's very, very weak, so it's okay to approximate. So you have all sorts of approximations going on. So in the end, what I'm just saying is that you should judge the quality of this risk-driven approach by what it does at the very end of the process, the decisions. Dealing with high-dimensional probabilities, I would say, to do with, I would say, numerical assessment of probabilities in a very high-dimensional space comes with all sorts of quirks. Whether the sort of techniques are appropriate or not should really be judged by the end-game results, not, I mean, again, we have at Lokad, and there is plenty of metrics that are known to assess the quality of a probabilistic forecast, but it's typically not going to be very, very insightful.
Okay. So again, when you're talking about judging the quality of the forecast by the end result, you're not talking about necessarily the accuracy of the forecast, but rather how much money was made or lost? Is that what you mean?
Yes, exactly. And
well, that's very difficult for some people. Forgive me, I don't want to be condescending, but the idea of, well, are you saying the idea of I want a more accurate forecast is technically wrong in terms of risk management?
So first I say, when you say you have, let's say, a 20% inaccurate forecast, those percentages, this is a completely, I would say, made up unit. You know, those percentages, they are not kilograms. They are not kilowatts. They are not something that has any kind of tangible reality. This is made up. And people say, oh, but we're so used to those accuracy percentages being expressed as a percentage that surely it must be real. I say, not at all. You can have exceedingly damaging forecasts that happens to be where the inaccuracy expressed as a percentage is very low. And that's an anecdote that I've been given over and over, where you can just forecast zero demand for a store, and that will very quickly give you a very accurate forecast. You forecast zero, you replenish zero, and the forecast becomes 100% accurate. So you have a measurement expressed in percentages, but this unit is not very sensical. If I tell you that you can have, for a probabilistic forecast, a measurement expressed in cross-entropy, that's very made up. That's very abstract, and that's not going to be super insightful. But the case that I'm making is that it's not that cross-entropy is, I would say, it's basically as abstract, as virtual, and as opaque as the percentages. You know, it's the same thing. It's very made up. And the only reason why, for example, at Lokad we would pick cross-entropy is that it has good properties when it comes to getting to the final decisions.
For example, how, sorry?
Sorry?
How, sorry?
For example, cross-entropy exhibits very steep gradients, which facilitate learning high-quality models. Okay, that's a very, very technical thing, and thus, but it works, and it works in what sense? It works by judging the end game results, which is the decision generated at the very end of the process.
And which ultimately results in reduced euros or dollars of error.
At least
that's the metric. That's the salient metric.
For people who operate from this, I would say, from this risk-driven perspective. Again, if you operate from the time series perspective, you're thinking in terms of just like a car manufacturers with defect that would kill people. You say, you know what? We don't count dollars. We just want to make sure that we are exceedingly safe and that we are, safe almost beyond measurements.
So if you, let's say, have an entire division dedicated to managing risk, assessing risk, but at base your supply chain is predicated upon a time series forecasting approach, is it your position that That's almost paradoxical. Like it's a contradiction in terms.
No, it just means that the people who are doing risk management are just bureaucrats who have no, I would say, and whatever they do has no consequences
Well, it can
on
have
the
negative
company.
consequences.
Usually they just have no consequences. Not, you see, the thing is, how if you make a risk assessment, but if these things cannot marginally adjust every single decision being made in your supply chain, then you've made an assessment and you've just buried the assessment right after making the assessment. You see, if you say, oh, this supplier has a 2% risk of going bankrupt next year, okay, does it impact your purchase decisions? If it doesn't, then you've just buried your assessment.
You're ignoring risk.
Yeah, exactly. You're just
head in the sand.
So
to a degree.
And that's very strange because people would say, oh, but we have analyzed risk. Yes, but you're not acting on this assessment. And when I say acting, people really think about, that's a mistake, is that when people think, let's say, about supply chain, that's what you would hear in the media. They would say, oh, we should not have our factory in China. Yes, that's a very macro risk. That's one class of risk. But there are also much more mundane risk. So you decide once in a decade where you're going to put your next plant. Maybe for some very large companies, you would decide, once a year, where do you put your next plant? But you have to be a very large company. So this is a risk assessment that is done very, very infrequently. And once you've taken your decision, you're kind of stuck with this decision for maybe, years, possibly decades. But there are all the mundane sort of decisions. So what do you buy? Where do you stock it? Do you increase or decrease your price points? Those are decisions that also comes with risk, and those decisions are made on a daily basis for every single SKU that you either buy, produce, or sell. And here, whatever assessment that in terms of risk you have about your supplier, your competitor, your clients, the question is that if there is not something that numerically connect the dots between this assessment and those very small decisions that you take, then you're not properly managing the risk.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, are you saying that most people's conception of risk management is on the macro scale, like a massive event that completely disrupts chains, but your position is that the more important, the more pressing risk management is on the day-to-day smaller decisions?
Both are very important, but let's be real about how much you can be truly informed to take the right decision. Let's say, for example, we are in 1991. The USSR just fall apart. Is it the right time to invest in Russia? They will open up to capitalism. Should you go to Russia? Should you not go to Russia? It's incredibly. People who would say, "Oh, we know exactly what would happen." That's a super bold claim. So you see, the thing is that for those macro decisions, I would say to a large extent, it's a gamble. It's a complete gamble. And it's fine, that's capitalism. This is an economy of profits and losses. People take risk, and there is chance is involved. And I'm saying, well, you can't really have a practice that will. I don't believe in somebody who could tell me whether entering a new market, for example, is safe or not. You can make assessment. You can try to work. You can try to rationalize a little bit the process. But fundamentally, it is something that kind of evades statistics and quantitative analysis. On the contrary, if you supply chain, you take literally a mid-size company is going to take tens of thousands of decisions a day, every single day. And thus, what I'm saying is that unlike the big macro decisions where you gamble, and there is no other really alternative except going with your gut assessment. In this case, of those tens of thousands of decisions that have to be taken on a daily basis, you can do a quantitative assessment and something that actually makes sense.
Well, to get away from, let's say, the colossal examples, like the macro scale ones, to bring it down to something like the SKU level. So we have a number of stores. We have 10 stores, and we have a finite amount of inventory of white T-shirts, and all 10 stores need white T-shirts. What would be the probabilistic, most risk-informed way of distributing what I have amongst all the stores of need?
I mean, okay, let's take the classic perspective. So the classic perspective, time series forecast, you're going to assume you know the future, so you have a safety stock. So basically you say every store should have this quantity in stock. And then to acknowledge the little residual uncertainty on top of that, you're going to add a small buffer, and that's your safety stock. So, and all stores are treated independently. And the idea is that you should have enough stock to cover all your stores. Now, what is an actual risk? The risk is you can run out of stock at the warehouse level. And then the question becomes, I have a resource that is limited at the warehouse. What should I do for my various stores? And if you just do it the classical way we say, I have my safety stock, I just do the allocation for the first store. I have still inventory left, I repeat the process for a second store. And then maybe at the fourth store, I will stop because there is no inventory left. So what you've done is effectively fill up the first 4 stores and send nothing to the others. You see, this is not very smart. This is not
risk management.
This is not. Yeah, this is you're not dealing properly with this situation, this small mini crisis that you have by having a product out of stock in the warehouse.
Well, what are the risks there, though, from a financial perspective? Because I've put things into stores, they'll all sell, surely, no?
No, because that's what your safety stock is about. When you put a safety stock, you're saying I'm putting units in a store that have a very low probability of being sold during my relevant time window. That's what the safety stock is there. It's a buffer that most likely you won't need. So if you want to maximize your sale, it's much better to just spread out the inventory so that every store has a little bit, so that all the stores conceptually kind of run out of stock at the same time. Obviously, you can't really get that, but that's what you want to get close to, the situation where you spread as much as you can, so that so that you run out at the same time everywhere, and with a little bit of luck, you don't run out of stock. I mean, first you will run out of stock, so you will sell everything. Because let's have a look at the alternative situation where you've concentrated the stock on the first 4 stores. Well, you have all the other stores that are out of stock, so you don't sell at all. And for those, you're only going to sell something like half of the inventory, so you're going to have a lot of leftover. So you see, you end up in a situation where you have a store that is out of stock, while another one has comparatively excess stock. And
the demand in the stores that don't have stock goes unserved.
Yes.
So there's the risk.
Yes, and but again, you see, that's where I say. But that's I would say here we are talking of the risk of having an out of stock. So one way to do that, because you see what will happen very frequently is that it will not happen the way I just described. It will happen as you should decide, although there is still inventory left in the warehouse, that you won't replenish the store. So you have a store, you just have 2 units that are left. You would preferably have, let's say, 4 units in stock instead of 2. But due to the fact that you know that there is a risk of stock out in the warehouse, you want to keep the stock in the warehouse because there is a chance that another store end up prematurely with a stock out, and you will need those units to be sent to this store in priority. So you see, that's where this risk assessment, it's about also having a look at stuff that haven't happened yet. So here I was describing your situation where you are facing the stackout in the warehouse, but the reality, when Lokad does this sort of optimization, you would do it ahead of time when you see that a product in the warehouse is at risk of going out of stock, and thus you should start preserving the stock in the warehouse so that the very best stores can still have a little bit of merchandise.
So as opposed to the time series approach, which would treat each of our 10 stores independently,
yes.
The probabilistic approach would take the network and the contingencies or the interdependencies between all of these stores and the relation to my available inventory.
Yeah, I mean, and here you see safety stocks in a very limited sense. It is a probabilistic approach. You know, it's a normal distribution, but it's a very low dimensional, and it's every single piece is treated independently. And yes, and implicitly when we say a risk-driven approach, we mean that every single opportunity and risk within the supply chain network is balanced against all the other opportunities and risk in the supply chain.
Well, now, I'm curious about how exactly can a company manage all of this? Because that's a lot of information compared to, let's say, the traditional time series approach. Is the only way to manage all of this through automation, or are people still involved checking these decisions?
So the way Lokad do it is that we typically automate the whole thing. People are there to supervise the automation. But the reality is that most companies, although they claim that they have that everything is manually validated, most companies have been using fully automated process for a long time. Whenever you have like a min-max inventory setup with a min and a max, well, you have a replenishment automaton that just run typically unattended. So that has already been the case of having extensively automated setups for decades. Lokad is not, it's just one more step in this direction, but it's not necessarily such a game changer compared to what people had beforehand. It's more automated, but many companies already operate on highly automated setups.
Well, could a company that doesn't leverage automation, but let's say, as I mentioned earlier, has entire divisions of experts in risk management?
Those companies are fairly rare.
Okay, right.
Those companies are fairly rare.
Well, it also occurs to me that we've sort of centered the entire conversation around more tangible risks. Like we've talked about SKUs, we've talked about stores, we've talked about floods. These are all very tangible resources or assets and the commensurate risks. Are there intangible risks? Things, I don't know, like time, bandwidth, knowledge, all of these things that sort of go into the running of a company. I mean, what are the risks there, or how do we manage those risks?
So there are intangible risks. For example, if you are a fashion company and you do sales, then your customers get, you generate an expectation that those discounts will happen again in the future. And so people modify their behavior. Estimating, quantifying this process in theory is possible. In practice, it's very difficult because this sort of, I would say, of building the expectation of your customers is something that is done over many years. So it's not something where experimentation is like super easy. And let's say, for example, your soft luxury, if you have a conviction that you should never do promotions because it devalues your brand, you're not going to do a 5-year test to see if doing promotion truly devalues your brand. At some point you need to operate on convictions and judgment call as opposed to do the test. So you have this sort of risk, and for example, the cost of that is generated by doing a promotion is very real. The way Lokad do it is that say, when you do a promotion, you have a certain amount of euro, which is what you immediately forfeit. So you lower your price, so you give up some margin. That's an immediate cost, but there is also this extra risk of bad habits being generated on the customer side, and you need to quantify those euros. And maybe you're just going to guesstimate something, but it's intangible. In this sense, estimation could be, in theory, be done, but in practice it's way too complicated, or it's way too slow. And so you still factor it. And it's better as opposed to ignore that the problem doesn't even exist. And then you have also other classes of risk, such as, for example, being IT dependencies. You can have software that falls apart. You can have plenty of other things that just impact your supply chain. But I would say those sort of, for example, let's say an IT problem, we are back with the sort of risk that are a bit like in manufacturing. You want, let's say, your ERP to be 100% uptime. This is not like a financial trade-off. We say, well, we are going to be like a 97% uptime. No, you just want to be 100% uptime. There is no reason to have downtimes. You can engineer your way into something that is incredibly close to 100% uptime. So there are plenty of other, sort of risk, but the other risks like IT problems, they are more into the classic sort of risk, as in manufacturing, where you just want to eliminate those risks. And there is, if it's done properly, it is not, I would say, it is not wishful thinking to have a plan to eliminate those sort of risks. It can be eliminated. For example, Amazon, if you look at the website, Amazon, they have very, very few downtimes. They might have maybe something like minutes of downtime per year. So it's literally, they are very, very close to from 100% uptime.
It occurs to me, you just mentioned that from a pricing strategy perspective, discounts might inculcate bad consumer habits. And what did you mean by that?
So whenever you do a promotion, a customer will see that you do a promotion. So next time they will say, I will not buy full price. I will just wait until you do a promotion again. I've seen you do promotions, so I know that promotion do happen with your brand. So I can wait. I will wait until you do a promotion, and then I will buy. And obviously, if you do one promotion per decade, people would say, well, this brand, they almost never do promotions, so I can't just wait. But if you do, 4 promotions a year, like clockwork, then customers are smart. They will respond to that, and they will just delay their purchase until you do your promotion, and then they will purchase.
So the probabilistic methodology would be able to model
No. The problem is that nothing will be truly able to model that. And again, that has nothing to do with probabilistic analysis. The thing is, modeling this psychology of your customers is mostly beyond your grasp, because it takes a decade to shape the mindset of your customer. For example, initially, when, for example, Amazon entered France 2 decades ago, they decided that as a price point, they would be expensive. And they had immense difficulty to get traction in France because as an e-commerce, they were quite expensive compared to all their competitors. Then they decided to, be very aggressive on price. And it took like 3 years or so for people to realize that Amazon had changed in France and that they were quite aggressive price-wise. So you see, it's when you put a price, you convey a message to your customers, and people pay a degree of attention, but it takes time to sink in. So there is a substantial inertia, and you can try to do fancy modeling to estimate exactly what will be the impact, but the reality is that as this sort of things takes years, you're not going to be able to experiment much. You're not going to be able to do much validation of whatever techniques you're using. Thus, in reality, you need to make judgment calls. That's just what I'm saying. And it's, what I'm saying, it's real, so it needs to be quantified somehow, but it's not going to be quantified with elaborated techniques. It's mostly going to be judgment calls, and it's fine. It's fine.
So that's an element of the risk management protocol that will still be within the remit of people reaching a consensus. Do we want to liquidate dead stock? Do we want to hang on to it forever, or do we want to sell it in a promotion?
Yes, and also when you have this risk-driven approach, it is much more, I would say, compatible with those sort of guesstimation compared to a traditional time series planning forecast where this sort of things had no place. Again, if I tell you about this idea that years ago when I met with a CEO of a large retail company, and we basically agreed that as an initial hypothesis, we would say that for every euro of discount, there will be a second euro of bad habits being generated among the customer base. Why? Well, because it was simple, and that was much better. We had an agreement that it was much better to have this very crude assessment as opposed to just ignore the problem of the bad habits that you generate when you do a promotion.
Well, that sort of sounds like a rule of thumb, and the next question is.
And if you go for a time series, from a time series perspective, this thing has no place. You can't inject the proposition. So this statement I made, €1 of discount, should come with €1 of virtual, problematic, bad expectations in the future. You can't inject that.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you do a risk-driven method, where in the end you have those decisions that comes with euros of cost and rewards, adding those euros of bad habits, well, it's very straightforward.
So the guiding principle for determining which sort of back of the napkin rule of thumb policies companies should take should be, does it contribute to a greater return, or how can you determine which ones we should keep?
I mean, when it is feasible to do something, a quantitative assessment, go for a quantitative assessment. But when it is not, and yet there is a general agreement that it is important, then you should guesstimate. I think that's a very dangerous path to say we don't have reasonable numbers, and thus we pretend it doesn't exist. It does exist, and thus you need to guesstimate. It's better to have a number that is approximately correct as opposed to exactly wrong.
Exactly wrong. Well, I feel like we're kind of wrapping up a little bit, but I would like to ask, and it may be a bit of a difficult question, but you talked about if a quantitative analysis is financially prohibitive. So for bigger companies that can afford more elaborate forecasting and risk management policies, they can perhaps take the probabilistic approach. For for companies that don't have that sort of disposable cash, what advice would you give in terms of risk management that would be actionable?
So I would challenge, can you really afford to ignore the risk? Because you see, that inventory costs money. I mean, putting it's on our website, but basically the price plan for, and here I'm having my cap of the salesperson of Lokad, but having a supply chain scientist to assist you in optimizing your decision is something like, I mean, our entry subscription is at something like €2,500 a month, or $2,500 a month. Yes, it's a substantial amount of money, but if you're not like a tiny company, if you're a $10 million or euros plus company, this is not a huge amount of money. It's actually a fraction of what you pay for just a single person. And if you happen to have 5+ people that are fulfilling supply chain functions such as inventory replenishment, production scheduling, inventory allocation, pricing management, if you have like half a dozen of people who are doing those functions, and they have a process that just ignore entirely the risk, I would say, can you really afford to continue doing that? Because you see, it's highly asymmetric. Ignoring those risks may cost you, even if you're just a $10 million company, it may cost you multiple millions of dollars just because you made a very, very bad call by just completely ignoring the risk. And that's why I say it's, so my take is that due to the fact that it's unusual, people would expect that it's only the things that are reserved to companies like Amazon and whatnot. No, it is not. It is, and to a large extent, the classical time series forecast is much more complicated. And the reason is it mismatches the problem. And so, yes, on the surface, it looks simpler because people are used to time series. But when it comes to the actual resolution of the problem, it completely mismatches the actual problem. And thus, this solution, although it looks easy, in practice is nightmarish to deploy and use. In comparison, the sort of probabilistic forecast that Lokad is using for small clients, small companies, it is unusual, but it does fit the problem nicely. And thus, in the end, and that's, again, in my lectures, I give example, is that if you want to have a look at probabilistic techniques, most of my code example are less than 20 lines of code long. So people would say, oh, this is impossibly complicated. I say, well, it's like 20 lines of code, and you can go to give the full detail of the method in a lecture that is like 1 hour and a half. So, I mean, again, can you really say that something that your company is so small that you can't afford spending something like a few tenths of hours on a case? Is it really beyond your means? I mean, yes, if you're like a boutique with just one person, but if you're a company that do $10 million plus of turnover per year, you're not a boutique. You already have things at stakes, and mistakes can cost a lot more. And conversely, because it's not just the mistakes, it's also opportunities, can, if by raising your price at the right moment, you increase your margin by 10%, that can result in a few hundreds of thousands of dollars of pure cash flowing into your company, and that really offset the cost of having some people spending time on risk.
So if I were to summarize that, it would be essentially there is an element of leap of faith, but the water's not that cold once you jump in?
I would say it's not so much leap of faith. I mean, again, I think there is this very weird idea that that's the supply from the mainstream supply chain theory. Risk do not exist, quite literally. I mean, you have those super gentle fluctuations of demand and super gentle fluctuations of lead times modeled with normal distributions, which is, whenever people say normal distribution, it's a way to say there is no risk. And the reality is that I've never met any entrepreneur that was not fully aware that the business that they have is full of risk all over the place. And the sort of insanity is that with the mainstream supply chain software, people pretend that the risks aren't there, but the risks are still there, and thus companies routinely face catastrophes that are very, very costly due to risks that were not like, again, I'm not saying like investing, entering the Russian market in 1991, thinking that it will work, that suddenly it's going to become, the new El Dorado. I'm saying companies face catastrophes for things that were entirely preventable, things that were really, I would say, within the realm of the expected sort of risk, such as suppliers having problems, prices going up or down, demand fluctuating, but not outside what could be expected, from the general evolution of the market, these sort of things. And so my point is that there is this insanity where most mainstream practices just completely ignore risk. And when people are, when I talk to supply chain practitioners, they would say, yes, there is plenty of risk, but the problem is that they can't bridge a gap. And I say it's not very difficult. It's just very different from what you're doing. And all in all, it's actually cheaper because it also leads to a higher degree of automation, because also one of the reasons why you need so many people when you do supply chain with time series is that due to the fact that you have a massive mismatch between the reality and those time series, you need to have a lot of people to just duct tape the process all the time. But if you have something where you have a better match, you don't need nearly as many people to duct tape the thing.
And on that note, I think I'll draw things to a close. Joannes, thank you very much. As usual, it's been a pleasure. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.